Thanks, David, for the invitation and introduction. Hello, everyone. Today, I'll talk about a recent work on parallel in-time simulation of biofluids. And this is joint work with a postdoctoral researcher, Weifan Liu, also at Syracuse University. So the type of fluids that I work on are around these dynamic biological structures, more specifically microstructures. So here I'm showing you a few examples. On the first row, you see volvox communities of these green algae. They are able to swim in the water by wiggling the cilia on the surface of this hollow sphere. And another picture is also a ciliated cell. Again, this unicellular organism is able to navigate the surrounding fluid by wiggling the cilia it's covered in. On the second row, I'm showing some cilia in airways of our lungs, which help us propel mucus and foreign particles out of our lung. And in the middle there, you can see flagella of E. coli. And on the right, you can see tails of sperm. And these microorganisms swim quite differently than us or larger organisms, and they really rely on these structures such as cilia and flagella to navigate their surrounding environment efficiently. So my work has been very much on the efficient calculation of the fluid around these structures. Here is a less pretty picture. Basically, I just want to show a 2D sketch of how these structures are represented in the computation. Although this is 2D, all the calculations that I will show later are in 3D. So basically, we discretize these structures using a Lagrangian grid. These red dots that you're seeing in this picture. And these structures are flexible. So usually we model them using springs. So you can think of little springs connecting each pair of dots. And they're going to generate forces, which is going to push the fluids, and the fluids in turn deform the structures, so on and so forth. And usually we're interested in simulating these structures for a period of time, which means we need to track a number of particles in this fluid. And by particles, it could mean grid points on the structures that you've just seen, these red dots, or it could be passive tracer particles in the fluid that's not on the structures themselves. In either case, we need to solve an initial value problem, the following. So MP is the number of particles that you're interested in tracking. This XI is the position of the ith particle, whether it is on the structures or in the fluid. The dot here is the time derivative. So this is just the time derivative of position equals velocity. U here is the fluid velocity at location X and time T. So we then use a numerical ODE solver to approximate the solution. Here I gave one example, which is the Forer-Euler method with the step size denoted by tau. So if you use Forer-Euler method to march in time, then in order to solve this system of initial value problem, the system of ODEs, you do the following at each time step, right? And Once again, tau here is the step size and time. And this is how you update the location of each particle. And this implies that at each step, you have to use a solver for fluid structure interactions to evaluate the velocity here. And of course, there are many choices for this solver: boundary integral equation method, inverse boundary method, method of regularized Stokes slits, which is what I will be using, and Rani, Prager, Yamakawa tensor, and etc. I want to emphasize that my talk is going to be focused on how to solve the ODE efficiently. So it's not super important which solver you use for fluid structure interaction. Just think of your favorite fluid structure interaction solver. All right. So again, the main point of this talk is to accelerate the solution of this system of ODEs. And I will be using parallel computing. So here, I first want to talk about these two fashions of parallelization. Again, let me remind you that we need to solve the system of ODEs, initial value given. The more commonly used parallelization is the spatial parallelization. By that, I meant the following. At each time step, you calculate the position of these particles in parallel. Okay, so you assign a number of particles to a certain processor, and then after this time step is completed, you move on to the next time step. So I would say this is the more commonly used method. Temporal parallelization is less known, in my opinion, and it is a little bit weird. So instead of dividing up the particles, you're going to now subdivide the time domain, which is now from 0 to capital T. You divide this domain into NC slices, I'm sorry. NC here is the number of cores. All right, so here I give you a simple sketch. I'm assuming that I have 5 computer cores, and this red interval is from 0 to T. So I'm dividing this interval into 5 slices. I'm going to assign each slice to a different core. And the idea is quite simple. I now have 5 initial value problems. I want to solve them in parallel using the 5 computer cores. So the idea is simple. However, you may notice that I have quotes around the initial value problems. This is because you don't actually have 5 initial value problems, because you only know the initial value at time 0. You actually don't have initial values at these interior time points. So it's not as simple as solving 5 independent initial value problems in parallel. All right, so in the next couple of slides, I will explain how to solve this problem. That is, we need to find initial values for these interior points with question marks on them. But the basic idea is very simple. You want to divide your original initial value problem into n of them, n independent initial value problems, and you want to solve them in parallel on multiple cores. All right. So here I want to give you an overview of the parallel in time method that I will be using, which is called Parareal. It's one of the most common parallel in time methods, I would say. So the first thing I want to say about this solver is that it is an iterative ODE solver. That is, it's going to make multiple passes on this time interval. if you think about the more commonly used ODE solvers, such as Fuller-Euler, Runge-Kutta, etc., you'll simply make one pass on this interval, right? You have some time step, and you just move from one time step to the next, to the next, to the next, until you reach time t, and then you're done. And this is an iterative method. Like all iterative methods, you make multiple passes, and from iteration to iteration, you're hoping your solution will be improved. And the second thing that I want to say about this method is that it employs two ODE solvers, one fine solver. By fine solver, I meant it is more accurate. However, it is also slower, more time consuming. And a coarse solver, by that I meant a method that's less accurate, but takes less time to run. All right, so you can think of the fine solver being the Runge-Kutta method and the coarse solver being Fuller-Euler method. And since we are actually solving PDEs, the fine solver may also have finer spatial discretization. And Parareal, like I said, it's an iterative method, and it actually alternates between what's called a serial sweep and a parallel sweep. In the serial sweep, you want to make a very quick pass from time 0 to time t using the coarse solver. Remember, the coarse solver, although it's less accurate, it's faster to run. So you want to make fast passes from 0 to t in serial. And the parallel sweep is to apply the fine solver to solve these independent initial value problems in parallel. So although each solve is going to be more computationally costly, they are done in parallel. So you need to solve, for example, these 5 initial value problems restricted to the 5 subdomains, but they can be done in parallel. All right. So whenever you need to do serial computation, you use the coarse solver, and whenever you need to you do parallel computing, you use the fine solver. Right. And the serial sweep is going to tell you what these question marks are. That is, it's going to estimate the initial conditions for the initial value problems, so that you can solve the initial value problems in parallel. By the way, please feel free to stop me if anything is not clear. So now I will give you more details. Like I said, this method is iterative. You make multiple passes on this time interval. So I apologize that the notation is a little bit complicated. I have x subscript n, superscript k. The subscript here tells you, so indicates the time point. So here I have t1, t2, t3, all the way to t5. So n runs from, from 0 to 5. Okay, it's the time point. And k here is the iteration count. So as you can see here, I have the first iterates. They have the superscript 0. So that's the estimate I get in my first or initial iteration. And then I do a second iteration. So now the superscript changed to 1. And hopefully this iteration produced more accurate result than the previous iteration. And then I have my third iteration with superscript 2. And hopefully this is a further improvement to my previous iterates. All right, so this is, again, the notation-wise, this is a bit messy. And I also have these two notations, script F and G. Script F is going to denote fine solver, and script G is a coarse solver. So what this means is I propagate from a starting time to an end time using the fine solver, and this whole thing denotes the solution. And this second thing, also propagating from a starting time to an end time, but using the coarse solver instead. And the initial condition is x start. So these are another two pieces of notation. Basically, they denote solutions obtained by the fine solver or coarse solver. All right, so these are some notations to keep in mind. Here are some details. This is perhaps the most busy slide of my talk and most technical. What I'm going to do here is just to walk you through how to perform the first iteration, the ones marked with 0, and the second iteration, the ones marked with 1. And then the future iterations are quite similar. So the x0, 0, which is this value here, is given to you. It's basically the initial value x0. All right, so remember, we want to solve these 5 independent initial value problems, but we need initial values, right? So this is what the first serial sweep is for. So I have this value given, x0, 0. Then I need a value here. Okay, so what I do is to use the coarse solver, propagate from T0 to T1 with initial guess x0, 0. So then I get an initial value for this interior time point. And then I move on to the second one. Of course, I can do the same thing. I can just propagate from T1 to T2 using this value that I just obtained, x1, 0, and so on and so forth. As you can see, in order to obtain the current estimate at the current time point, you need to be done with the previous time point already. So this must be done in serial. Okay, it must be done one after another, after another, after another. This is a serial calculation, and I'm going to use the coarse solver, which is not that accurate, but hopefully very fast. All right, so at this point, after the first serial sweep, we have all the values whose superscript is 0. So we have some sort of initial guess for all these initial value problems, and we can start doing the parallel computation. So this is the first parallel sweep in which we solve all these problems in parallel. So again, notice that you already have these initial values, and x11, x21, their computation does not depend on one another. That's why they can be done in parallel. Okay, so here, because it's going to be done in parallel, I can afford to use the fine solver, which is more accurate, although more time consuming. All right, and then remember, I told you earlier, Parareal is a method that alternates between serial sweep and parallel sweep. So I've done one serial sweep, I've done one parallel sweep. So the next serial sweep, what I will do is the following, and this is a bit technical, but hopefully I can convince you why we need to do this. So this is an update. Remember, we calculate this value here based on the initial guess obtained using the coarse solver, right? So, but at this point, we also realize that, oh, I was using x10, okay, which is the older initial guess, but now I actually have x11. So naturally we thought, well, what if we use x11 instead here? Since the initial guess is more accurate, our result is going to be more accurate as well. All right, so this is what the update step is. In here, in the first term here, you can see the update here is the difference between two solutions, right? The first solution, you propagate from T1 to T2 using the updated initial guess, okay, from your parallel sweep, all right, using the coarse solver. And minus, this is another solution produced by the coarse solver, but again, propagating from T1 to T2, the only difference is in the second term here, I'm using an older initial guess. Okay, so the only difference between these two terms is the initial guess. So the update essentially gives you the following quantity. It's the improvement you can possibly gain if you use a better initial guess. All right, so remember this x21 from the parallel sweep, it's using the older initial guess. So by adding the update to it, I'm essentially getting this quantity here, which is the fine solve from T1 to T2, but using a better initial guess. All right, so the update here accounts for the improvements introduced by using a better initial guess. All right, and this has to be done in serial because if you notice here, right, you actually need the previous value in order to do the current value, the current time step. So this step has to be performed in serial. But again, you're getting the update using the core solver. So hopefully, although it is done sequentially, it is relatively fast because you use the core solver. So I just walk you through the first serial sweep, the first parallel sweep, and the second serial sweep. And that tells you how the quantities with superscript 0 and the quantities with superscript 1 are obtained. And you just essentially repeat this process, serial sweep, parallel sweep, and then serial update to obtain the future iterates. So this is, in essence, how Parareal works. Once again, whenever you need to do some calculation in sequentially, you use the course solver, and in the parallel sweep, you switch to a fine solver. Okay, and once again, if there's anything that's not clear, please let me know. So this is really the most complicated slides in this talk. All right, so this sketch here, I'm trying to illustrate the runtime of Parareal. So like I mentioned earlier, we do a serial sweep. We solve these 5 initial value problems, but we have to do them in serial or sequentially. So as you can see, in the runtime, you have to do this 5 times, right? So each runtime here is the time that's required to solve this problem using a core solver. And once you've obtained the initial conditions, you actually have 5 completely independent initial value problems, which you can solve in parallel. Right, so although you need to solve 5 initial value problems, because they're done in parallel, you only count the runtime once. Okay, and this is much longer than these runtimes earlier because it's a fine solver, right? And then you switch to serial sweep again, and so on and so forth. So this is how the runtime looks like for this method. So I saw a question. I apologize, I just saw it. Someone has a question about Tn. Is it just a single time step tau? So in my calculation, Tn, this slice here is multiple taus, but it could also be a single tau, yeah. It depends on the number of cores. If I have 40 cores, then I divide this into 40 slices, and each slice may or may not contain multiple taus. I hope that answers your question. Sorry, I just saw it. All right, so let me continue. And one observation that's very important here is during the serial sweep, you notice that only 1 core is utilized. So that seems to be a bit wasteful to us. And when we were developing our own methods, we try to utilize these idle cores as well. All right. So now I will talk about our recent work, which is still under revision at this point. So to the best of our knowledge, we're the first to apply parallel in time methods to simulate biofluids. And while we were doing that, we realized if you just use the quote unquote off-the-shelf course solvers, it's not fast enough to give us a decent speed up, right? So then our focus becomes how can we develop or devise better course solvers? And this has become the main part of our work. So as a summary, I'll just tell you that we have developed these non-intrusive course solvers. I will explain them momentarily. These course solvers are also straightforward to parallelize. So we actually take advantage of all the idle cores during the serial sweep. All right, so typically when you have a solver for biofluids, you need at least the following two ingredients, at least in the kind of simulation that I'm interested in. So we need a solver for fluid structure interactions that allows us to calculate the flow field, right? So once again, examples of these solvers, method of regularized stroke slits, which is what I will be using today, but really you can use any method that you want, for example, inverse boundary method. And you also need an ODE solver to march in time, for example, for Euler method, Runge-Kutta method, etc. All right, so the new solvers that I'm going to talk about, they're not these sort of standard solvers, but they use the standard solvers as building blocks, right? So I'm going to introduce some new notation here. So here G sub alpha tau is a course solver parameterized by these two numbers, alpha and tau, these two parameters. And alpha is just a parameter. It's rather vague at this point, but it really can be a number of different things. For example, viscosity of the fluid, stiffness of the springs. Remember, I said earlier that these structures, they're flexible. So usually we model them using a network of springs, or even the regularization parameter in the method of regularized stroke slits. If you're not familiar with this solver, this is not a problem at all. This is just some parameter in our fluid structure interaction solver. So anyways, alpha is just a parameter. It could be many, many things, a physical parameter or a numerical parameter. And tau here is the size of the time step used by the ODE solver. Okay, so basically I'm going to take a family of off-the-shelf course solvers and trying to combine them and to produce some new course solvers with better performance. So I hope that's clear. So for this G, you can just think of any solvers you're currently using. Just note that we need the flexibility to change some of these parameters. This is a little bit weird at this point, perhaps because the viscosity of the fluid, usually it's set in stones, right? When you have your application, you know what's the viscosity, and usually we try not to mess with that. And hopefully and the stiffness of the springs, again, it should be dictated by your application and we shouldn't mess with it. Hopefully in the following few slides, I can convince you sort of the advantage of massaging these parameters. So we make the following observations, which are very important for the development of these new solvers. The first observation I've already made, only one core is utilized during serial sweeps. Okay, so that seems like a waste. We would like to take advantage of all our cores, right? And the second observation I've also mentioned, we have many parameters in our solvers, viscosity, stiffness of the springs, or some parameter in your solver, whichever one you pick. And usually we don't want to change them because they should be dictated by the application, okay? But on the other hand, we also notice if you just disregard their physical meaning, right? If it's just a number in our calculation, it's not the viscosity, it does not have any physical meaning, then changing it sometimes gives you better computational efficiency. For example, it may allow you to use a larger time step, right? So on the one hand, you shouldn't change these parameters. On the other hand, if you're allowed to change them, you may end up with a more efficient solver. Okay, so we're trying to develop solvers that sort of balance these two considerations, if that makes sense. I see another question here. Does the ODE solver marching in time need to be an explicit method, or can implicit method be used also? It can be any solver you want as long as you have two of them, a pair of them. One of them is more accurate, either higher order method or smaller time step, smaller spatial discretization, and another one that's less accurate, but faster to run. I hope that's clear. It doesn't have to be explicit at all. All right. So like I mentioned earlier, we're not pulling these new solvers out of thin air. We are using existing solvers as building blocks. So more specifically, we're considering a family of existing solvers, and we try to combine them in some intelligent way, right? So I'm going to let alpha 0 denote the parameter value determined by the application. So remember, this alpha 0 can be a number of things, fluid viscosity, stiffness of the springs, thickness of the structures, so on and so forth. And there's always a value that's the right value, which is dictated by the application, okay? But remember, we also would like to take advantage of the fact that if you disregard the physical meaning and just view this as a regular parameter, you could sort of change it in order to get better performance. So this is what we're trying. We are going to consider a family of them. As you can see here, G sub alpha J are different than alpha 0. And we're going to do a linear combination of them using the weights that's in Lagrangian polynomial. So these WJs are whatever you get from the Lagrangian polynomial interpolation. And this is going to be, roughly speaking, alpha 0 tau. So roughly speaking, you actually recover this parameter that you actually want. All right, so this is our new one. It's a linear combination of a family of existing solvers. And why do we do this? Again, this is because if we use alpha j instead of alpha 0, we can get away with larger time steps. Okay, this is non-intrusive. By that I meant you pretty much don't need to change your existing solver in any way because we're just taking a linear combination of them. So you just need to change this parameter here, and whatever solver you're using before, you can keep using them. We're just going to use a family of them and combine the results according to the Lagrangian polynomial. And this is, it looks like, okay, before you have one solver, so you need to solve it once, the initial value problem once. Here it looks like you need to solve n times, but these solves are completely independent. So you can actually do them in parallel, and you just combine the solutions according to the Lagrangian polynomial. So this is, although it looks like you're using n solvers instead of a single solver, this is actually, when you use parallel computing, this is just one solver. And I hope that's clear. And again, the reason that I want to use alpha j instead of alpha 0 is that alpha j may allow me to use a larger time step, which will make the time stepping faster. So I hope that's clear. Again, this is a little bit weird, but you have to keep in mind that we are allowed to use multiple cores here, okay? So looks like we're making things more complicated, but this is going to give us a more efficient solve due to the larger time step tau. All right, so there are other ways you can combine these existing solvers, right? And we can use Richardson extrapolation in the time step. Right? So again, I'm replacing a single solver, a single off-the-shelf solver by a sequence of them. So this is these weights. VI is a bunch of weights, and they're calculated according to the Richardson extrapolation, which you probably have seen in maybe a high, an undergraduate level numerical analysis class. And we know that Richardson extrapolation is going to raise the accuracy in time. So if the G is a Fourier method, for example, then it's first order in time. But if you combine it this way, you can raise the accuracy in time from order 1 to order m if you use m terms, right? So this is again non-intrusive, meaning that use whatever solver you have. There's really very little change to them. You just need to change the time step. Everything else can be the same, right? So we're just taking linear combinations of them. And again, although it looks like we're replacing one solver with m solvers, they're completely independent. You can run this m solvers in parallel. So it's sort of like raising the accuracy without really paying that much. Right, so this is another way that you can combine these existing solvers. Of course, you can then make things even fancier by doing both, right? Lagrangian extrapolation and Richardson extrapolation, and this is the result. And here, instead of one solver, we have m times n solvers. But again, keep in mind, you can parallelize these solves as long as you have enough computer cores. Again, these solvers are non-intrusive. Whatever you were using before, you can keep using them. You just need to change a time step or one other parameter, and then you take the linear combination of the solution at the end of your calculation, which can be performed in parallel. All right, so this actually allows you to have a faster and more accurate solver. Faster because you can use larger time steps. More accurate because you have risen the order of accuracy in time using Richardson extrapolation. So usually in an ODE solver, if you want faster, then you're losing accuracy. But using parallel computing, you can actually, and this sort of extrapolation, you can actually achieve faster and more accurate solves, which we think it's very interesting. So let me see if there's no questions. Good. Again, if there's more questions, please let me know. So next, I will briefly talk about our numerical results. We considered several different swimmers. The first one is the rod-like swimmers. So you can think of them as a model for bacterial flagella or tails of sperm. So these swimmers are represented by their center line, and we discretize this line using a Lagrangian grid, and they propagate some kind of helical wave or sinusoidal wave, and then they'll move they propagate in the water. So remember, there is an alpha there. Like I said, it could be many things. In this particular case, we considered bending modulus of this elastic rod, viscosity of the fluid, and regularization parameter of the regularized Stokes-Litz method. If you're not familiar with that method, that's totally fine. It's just some parameter used in the solver for fluid structure interaction. So we built our solver by varying these different values. Again, usually you shouldn't vary them because they have some kind of physical meaning, but using the extrapolation, you can actually, the end result is you are actually using the correct value, roughly speaking. And the physical parameters here, we are based on human sperm. We consider one filament, we use 300 grid points to discretize it and 40 cores. So you can see that this is an overkill, right? If you want to consider spatial parallelization, there's a lot of cores for not that many points. So in spatial parallelization, at least on our machine, in our implementation, we see no speed up. However, if you use Parareal and using the core solvers that I've just shown you, you can get a speed up between 5 and 25, depending on how accurate you want Parareal to be and a number of other factors, depending on the setup of the problem. And we also consider 5 filaments. So the goal here is to increase the spatial scale. So now instead of 300 grid points, you actually have 1500 grid points. And we use between 6 and 48 cores. And we want to compare the spatial parallelization and temporal parallelization. As I mentioned earlier, when you just have one filament or one rod, we don't see any improvement using spatial parallelization. Here you have more points, so it actually makes sense to use spatial parallelization. The blue curve is spatial parallelization, the speed up versus number of cores. The red curve is the temporal, the speed up of the temporal parallelization, again, speed up versus number of cores. Initially, when the number of cores is small, you can see that spatial parallelization is actually faster. You can gain more speed up, but as you increase the number of cores very quickly, temporal parallelization becomes more efficient. Once again, your spatial parallelization saturates because the number of points is just too few compared of the number of cores that you're using, right? So this is really good news if you don't have such a big spatial scale, but you have a lot of computing resources. You can actually use parallel in time methods to gain a better parallel speed up. So this is one example. The next example, we consider spheres. Okay, this is just top view of a sphere that's, you can use it to model some vesicles. And again, we're using sort of a network of springs. So the sphere is elastic and there is a little springs connecting each grid points. And so here I've shown the initial position. This is a unisphere in a shear flow. And the first picture is if I use this, the stiffest spring, as you can see, it just rotates and there's a very little deformation. And as the spring becomes less stiff, you get these, it's stretching out to be ellipsoid almost. And in this particular case, we consider alpha to be the spring constant, viscosity, regularization parameter. Once again, usually you're not supposed to mess with these parameter values. They should be dictated by the application, but we sort of use different values and to gain more efficiency because using different values of alpha may allow us to use larger time steps. Okay, and then you combine the different solvers using Lagrangian extrapolation, and it's effectively you're using the original alpha value. So there's no violation of your physical constraints. We consider one sphere, and it's discretized using about 650 grid points. And again, we use 40 cores. This is again an overkill if you're thinking about spatial parallelization. Just way too many cores, way too few grid points, so no speed up if you use spatial parallelization. And for parareal, again, we gain speed up between 2 and 20, depending on your how accurate you want the solver to be. Remember, the solver is iterative, so if you perform more iterations, it's going to get more accurate, but then the speed up is going to decrease. All right, so this is a second type of swimmer that we've considered to model vesicles. So what I'm showing you, this is the final slides on numerical results. I'm showing you two figures. Both are speed up versus era. And on the left one is for the rod example that you've seen, and the right one is for the sphere. So what I'm trying to show you is, like I said earlier, so if you want a more accurate solve, by the way, by era, I meant the relative era compared to the fine solve. All right, so this is the era between the parareal and the fine solve, whichever fine solver you use. I think here we used RK2 and RK4. So if you want, if the error tolerance is less stringent, such as in this area, then you can get very high speed up because you don't have to run parareal for that many iterations. But if you want it to be more accurate, then the speed up decreases because you need to run more iterations. Right? So once again, this is a iterative method, and the more iteration you run, the less efficient it is. Okay, so that's actually everything. This is my conclusion. We observe that parareal can speed up the simulation of biofluids when spatial parallelization fails. And we also notice that parallel speedup can be quite limited if we simply use the off-the-shelf coarse solvers. For that reason, we developed a number of non-intrusive and easy to parallelize novel solvers that can be constructed via extrapolation. So they're really super easy to implement. Whatever solver you're using right now, you just take a linear combination of them. And we notice these novel solvers can help increase the parallel speedup of parareal considerably. So I'd like to thank my brilliant collaborator, Wei-Fan Liu, the organizers of this seminar series for the opportunity to talk here, especially Professor David Smith for the invitation. And I would also like to thank the following funding agencies for supporting my work. So thank you very much.